Ooh, let's do a still for the thumb. The thumb has to be romantic. Okay, one of those will work. I'm gonna leave that in probably for you. It'll be a nice little hook. That's gonna be the lightest thing that you see this entire lecture because we're doing romance. And I know what you're saying, romance, but that's so romantic and fun and it's light and fluffy. Well, in the way that we talked about action adventure and how a lot of the tropes that you found in action adventure were based on trying to make the narratives more palatable and easily consumed and serialized, all of those things. Yeah, that same thing happened with romance. Except instead of capitalizing on the post World War II anxiety surrounding colonialism and the need for an adventure to explore the world or explore big cities, we're focusing in on the genre that men made for women, which really tried to capture what they wanted, which was presumably being at home forever. So we're gonna talk about that. It gets a little sad at times, but it's very enlightening. My experience with romance is a bit academic. I've read several older books and I have some fun recommendations for you, but the sources that I refer to in this one, first off, is Young Romance, written by Joe Simon and Jack Kirby. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. And some of the other research that I did was based on issue 36 of Panel by Panel, as well as Reading the Romance by Janice Radley, which I recommend you guys check out. It's a fun read. That really captures a lot of the psychological details of how romance works. So, romance as a genre or a feature in narrative storytelling is old as the tales of time. You're gonna find that to be a common theme as we talk about these larger genres. While comics were often used in like singular panels or told loose narratives, and there were times when visuals and text had a relationship that might be articulated as comics on some type of etymological level. For the most part, when we talk about comics, we're talking about within the past 100 years. But romance is way older than that, and a lot of the notions we get are going back to the Odyssey. All the stories go back to the Odyssey in the Bible, so, I'm probably not going to repeat that every week. Most famously, I think that the romance is captured by William Shakespeare in stories like Romeo and Juliet and stories like Much Ado About Nothing. Now that I've addressed that, just so I have all those naysayers who try to pretend like I didn't know what romance was prior to comics, we are going to fast forward it back to the post-World War II, a bit during World War II, and address how romance got translated into the medium of comics. And you'll find that it is very much indebted to a lot of tropes and ideas that were made for that medium and its easy accessibility and its mass consumption, especially prior to the popularization of television. But at its core, romance, as it was in Shakespearean times, as it was during Homer's Odyssey, the primary focus is to elicit a specific type of emotion. While action adventure might elicit excitement, romance will elicit empathy toward love and relationships and the accessibility to these day-to-day human connections, and you're supposed to feel that kind of connection through these stories. And we're going to see how comics elicited those feelings in 1947 when the romance comic was invented. Back when you had William Shakespeare, romance was always a part of the plot. It was a part of a larger scheme. Romance naturally entwined itself into a narrative. Classically, they would refer to the best way to distinguish a tragedy and a comedy was a tragedy, someone died, and a comedy, someone got married. And so romance and love weren't necessarily gendered. And I want you to really kind of hold on to that notion as we talk about the modern romance comic. And you'll also realize that this bleeds into modern romance novels, especially if you got any rom-com fans out there. A lot of these narratives are very gendered because of an attempt to capture a specific market. So romance comics started in 1947, and it was initially captured by these two lovely gents right here, Joe Shuster and Jack Kirby. Now, if those names sound familiar, they should, because those were the two that invented Captain America. And of course, Jack Kirby would go on to do tons of amazing work with Stan Lee over at Marvel Comics, including creating Fantastic Four and creating the X-Men, and then would move on to do great things at DC, creating Apocalypse and the New Gods and all of these amazing things throughout his career. And you will hear me sing his praises. In other lectures, I will sing his praises. But he, along with the co-creator of Captain America, Joe Simon, created Young Romance, and that was the first romantic comic, and it did gangbusters. Now, I'm going to mention that and then step back to another popular literary form, and this is, remember how I was talking about the pulps last week's lecture about action and adventure? Well, the pulps were also a big inspiration for romance comics. Specifically in the 1930s, romantic pulps were really popular. A lot of people were catching a hold of these. As the excitement was dying down in the 1940s, this is kind of where Jack Kirby and Joe Simon picked up that energy and really captured it, except they really focused in on a post-World War II romance. And in a post-World War II climate, a lot of what people were looking to do in all sorts of media and all sorts of propaganda were looking to get back to normal. You'll find that in a lot of events of tragedy, and in comics, this is World War II is gonna come up a lot, because post-World War II, there was this deep desire to get back to normal. And so what they framed as normal was to get back to a traditional household, get back your nuclear family. As you had veterans coming back, I mean, we could talk about the America as a whole in terms of the suburbs suddenly popping up, about the integration of non-Protestant whites into the landscape of whiteness and allowing for spaces to exist away from the racial diversity of big cities, the redlining that happened in big cities to keep things segregated. And then you could talk about, like, there's just a mountain of things occurring at this time that really influenced the way that these romance comics functioned. And so there are a lot of messed up things that occur in terms of the framing of what the female role is in these comics. And these were very much men making things up based on what they understood, which was nothing. And they were just making money off of loose things that they heard. Again, World War II just ended. People are moving out of the cities, going to the suburbs. Women have been working the entire time World War II was happening, because there are a lot of men off in Germany and Japan fighting, in Europe in general fighting, and they are about to return and they want their jobs back, and they're trying to get everything back to normal. And the best way to shape that narrative is through having these World War II veterans writing these comics. Reminder, Jack Kirby was a World War II veteran who had come back home wanting his job back. Now let's talk about the formal elements of romantic comics. Just let's knock that out first before I get into any more depth about the broader landscape. First off, it is plot driven. Now, I'm going to go over the 3 types of plots that existed in those stories, but it is plot driven. Often it feels character driven because conflict on the internal monologue of the main characters who exist in these stories, these characters being women. And so you had these male writers who were writing these stories about what it's like to be a woman, and that internal conflict of, should I engage with this past that I've had where women were working and bringing home the bacon, and that whole going to the factory, coming home, taking care of the kids, doing things on their own, or should I become a housemaker and I should take care of the kids and I should let my husband make the money and not worry about my personal education and my personal growth. So those were the internal conflicts that were reflected in these narratives. I'm going to go over the 3 plots shortly, but before we do that, I'm going to touch on the fact that these are internal conflicts, and the moral is paramount to the narrative arc, and that moral is often about conforming to normative standards of that time. And so those 3 types of plots that existed were: 1, the teen romance; 2, the college romance; 3, the young bride romance. The teen romance primarily focused in on the notion of being in high school, being a young romantic, and the main character feeling these urges. They have gone through puberty, and they have the curse, which is an old-timey term for having one's period. You got the curse, and so they are having these urges, and they are debating on if they should hook up with a young boy or look for somebody to get married to. Usually the person that they should get married to, as the story implies, is an older, more well-rounded gentleman who is working and has his life together. A young woman should be looking to graduating from high school and marrying an older suitor who's mature, someone who maybe got out of college. But that's where kind of this older man dynamic kind of played into these narratives with these teen romances. The other romance you had was number 2, the college romance. The college romance really emphasized the importance of college, because that is a good place to find a husband. And you'll hear this term floating around called the MRS degree, but it's the notion that a woman should go to college to find a husband and then not work. And this story was often the tale. You'll have a sordid woman who has these wild desires to have a career and is studying her major. And she wants to marry, and he seems to have it together, but she wants to follow her career. But she really does make the right decision, and she goes and marries the man and lets him take care of her. But she could have never found him if she didn't go to college. The final one was the young bride story. These are often the most discouraging. The young bride stories are about, it's your first year of marriage, the main character's having conflicts of being their own self and serving their husband and taking care of their household. And at the end of the day, if you don't take care of your husband, he's going to divorce you. It's probably going to be your fault. And so these tales are about how young women should always take care of their husband and always be respectful. And at the end of the day, if he divorces you, it's probably your fault. If he cheats on you, it's probably your fault as the wife. You should have been taking care of the house. You should have been doing these things. If you were curious about this degree of cynicism that I'm kind of spewing out, you would see this very present not only in the narratives, but you would see them in advice columns. Like Cosmopolitan and a lot of other women's magazines, they had advice columns. The writers and artists would usually bounce between these columns using female pseudonyms. So Dr. Clarice Jones, that's made up, by the way, there's no actual Clarice Jones, but Dr. Clarice Jones would have a column, and you would be able to send in your questions to Teen Romance, and usually you would have one of the writers, who would be an older white dude, who would respond to these teens with the pseudonym of an older woman to trying to ease their woes, which you could see how that is a bit problematic in terms of maintaining an honest perspective of what it is to be a woman, especially looking for advice. Having an older man pretend to be a woman giving advice about marriage, a bit dubious. And so these were kind of how these narratives were controlled. Now, in addition to some of those formal characteristics, you had specific aesthetics. If you compared romantic comics to other genres, one thing I found, especially later on in the romantic comics, the color was really fascinating. There was a lot of exploration, especially once romantic comics became popularized in the UK. And so if you're looking for interesting approaches to coloring, you could go back and look at a lot of romance comics, and they have really fascinating approaches to capturing imagery. But also the framing, a lot of images were very cinematic. There's a lot of horizontal panels. There's a lot of close-ups, and the focus is really on the acting of the characters, since they weren't focusing on dynamicism in the classic sense of maintaining an action narrative. The backgrounds in those spaces were often more domestic versus in other comics where the backgrounds and the spaces that these narratives existed in were either cities or exotic spaces, far off lands to explore. These narratives, since they were being marketed toward women, they were pretty much about how you should really learn to enjoy being inside your house. You should really learn to enjoy being inside the suburbs, because that is kind of the narrative that they're really proposing because this is what young ladies should be reading. Again, these morals that were projected onto these narratives were not necessarily a refined, laid out map of oppression. Those existed, but in other spaces. These were very normative. This is what a young lady should be reading. These are conversations people are having about the role of young women. Now, I think that there are great spaces in this to subvert some of these expectations. I think as we look at those specific elements of developing a romance comic, that it's plot driven, that it's still kind of an internally driven narrative, a lot of voiceovers, a lot of inner monologues, and that the moral is pivotal. Even though these are very specific morals, the one thing I really want you to walk away with is that the moral is pivotal to the story, but it's not necessarily the moral that these romantic comics were known for that is pivotal to the story. If you are trying to capture a moral of what you get out of a romance narrative, rather it be your own experience or even a critique of some traditional romance narratives, your moral is going to be really important to developing that. A part of understanding these tools is understanding that all these tools can be used in different ways. Even though this was primarily used to subvert notions of feminism, rather it be first wave, second wave, and later on third wave. Rather it was used to subvert any general anxieties surrounding normative societies and expectations. You can always turn that on its head and use those tools at their base to do what you will with them. And so I don't want you to feel like this is limiting how you can treat the romance structure and how you could apply these techniques. And this brings me to my favorite part, because I think in my mind, I've always divided romance into these two different spaces. One is the fantasy romance, and the other is the nightmare romance. And I think what comes to me with the nightmare romance, the difference between the two, the fantasy romance is about how a woman goes in and she conforms and she finds true joy, and she's like, oh man, suburbia, super sweet, very predictable narratives. But the nightmare romance is what happens to the woman who chooses to subvert expectations and does those illicit things and kisses boys. What happens to her? And usually these stories lead into two different characters. Now, the story won't lead into this first one, but this first one will always be hovering around in the story, which is the old maid character, which is like the main character's aunt, who chose to follow her career, and now she's miserable, and all she wants is her niece to never fall into the same holes that she did. What was she thinking going to college to get a degree? Now she's married to her job. Oh, the pain. Now, I don't find this character particularly interesting. I think that you could subvert that character and make them more interesting, but that character isn't particularly interesting. Now, the other character, this is where I'm fascinated by this other character. And this is the character you find in that nightmare romance. It is when the main character does not follow through with the system and they go crazy. This is in need of context. The hysterical woman has a long history. The term hysteria was coined in 400 BC by Hippocrates. And this was this notion that they'd figured out that for some reason the womb is connected to discomfort in women and pain, and they identified it as hysteria. Now, they did horrible things for years and years, up until Freud. So that's like, what's the math on that? A lot of thousands of years. Was it thousands? Yeah, thousands of years. They did all of these wild things, which were basically different torture methods. What we would later find out, thousands of years later, that a lot of the symptoms of hysteria were very similar to endometriosis. There are so many symptoms ended up being kind of like, this is just hysteria. If you're depressed, postpartum depression, hysteria. And so there it was associated as a physical element. And then this really smart guy named Freud said it's not physical, it's psychological, because women are crazy. And so to this day, when someone is being hysterical, it's because Freud associated women's pains, physical pains, is referred to as hysteria, and its complete lack of rationale is hysterical. And so that's where that word comes from. And so you'll see that in a lot of different art mediums, a lot of different narrative mediums, the notion of a woman being crazy has become really popularized. But that is where I find the most intrigue in these romantic stories, because the characters that they always defined as crazy, as hysterical, as suffering from hysteria, were always the strongest and most intriguing, dynamic women in these romance comics. They punished them as they did women in real life. But even in these fictional narratives, they were able to convey that these women existed and acknowledge their existence. These stories kind of, they ran from 1947, and in the 70s, they became less and less popular up until 1977, where all romance comics basically were discontinued. You could imagine what happened in the 70s, in the early 70s and the late 60s, that ended up destroying romance comics. Women. There were a lot of female writers who were getting jobs, and they were very aware of the stories that were being told in romance comics. And a lot of women wanted to actually write more romance comics because they felt like their stories would be more relatable to the young women who were reading those comics. A lot of older men said they did not know what sold to teenage girls. And so a lot of women, and keep in mind what It Ain't Me, Babe, an anthology that was introduced by Trina Robbins that eventually turned into women's comics, was 1970, and women's comics was 1972. And you had Tits and Clits and Twisted Sisters, and you had a bunch of underground comics that were really reflexive of more real women's stories. So especially if you're talking about college age readers, they're more likely going to be attracted to those narratives than anything else. So underground comics, the free love movement, and the general zeitgeist of the way women were represented in media overall, compounded with a new source of alternative voices in female narratives, really undercut the selling of these romance comics. And of course, instead of changing romance comics, they were just kind of like, oh, well, I guess people just don't like these anymore. And they discontinued them. Of course, like I said, Jack Kirby created Young Romance, that the actual title, Young Romance. And he ended up co-creating the Fantastic Four with Stan Lee. He ended up co-creating X-Men, and a lot of that experience of making romance comics allowed for a new type of character to exist. So prior to that, a woman's role in a superhero comic was Lois Lane. You had a damsel in distress. But now you had characters like Sue Storm, who were a little bit more fleshed out, still playing a mother role, but these notions of romance being an important element to storytelling as a whole became more prominent in superhero comics. I mean, and even now you could see that there's been a dramatic shift from the tale of the romance comic, of the teenager wanting to get married, of the college student that wants to get married. And even up to this point, when you look at those specific demographics, you realize that rather than looking at marriage as a major issue for young women, friends end up being a major priority. And romances tend to be tertiary to developing and maintaining friendships. And when you look at narratives like Archie, or books that Raina Telgemeier did, whether it be The Babysitter's Club or Smile, you realize that the friendship group ends up being a more significant element as far as attracting an audience than any single romance or a desire or longing for marriage, because a lot of people find friendships and developing those as a primary focus in one's life when they're in their teens and their 20s as being more relatable than obsessing over the notion of getting married. And as far as college age romances, or if you're in your general 20s, looking for more realistic depictions of the troubles and the traumas and the pains of romance can be found with authors like Mary Naomi, Phoebe Glockner, Julie Doucette. There are so many stories that fill in that gap. These are a lot of autobio comics. Those ended up taking out a lot of filling up a lot of those spaces that young romance used to. So again, I do want to emphasize that even though historically romances have functioned in a very specific way, there are still ways of using these simple tools to help contribute to your overall writing experience and allow for you to make quick and concise stories. And you could always use these tools to subvert expectations, or even use them to add to your approach, to quickly incorporate different elements into stories that you already have. For example, as far as a great way to subvert this, I have this book right here, Truer Than True Romance by Jean Martinet. This is an amazing book that kind of goes about this and goes about presenting the original work followed by a subversion of that work by altering the text. And so on the right one you see Stolen Dreams, and the left ones, I Hate My Hair. And they go through the way that these visuals are laid out and presented and kind of undercuts a lot of the work that was created to make jokes. And there are just different approaches to what is being presented and given to you. And in addition to that, you could always do what they ended up doing in Marvel in terms of finding ways of implying broader relationships and convey emotions within a narrative. If you were to take that first lecture, you're making your 7-page action comic, and then you were to incorporate 7 pages of a romantic comic, you would have an action adventure with a romance subplot, So you could always find ways of using these tools, and you could always not. So with that, I am currently selecting the reading, and so that thing will be posted up on Ghost Studio. Check that out on Thursday. I'm going to be doing a breakdown of the selected comic. I can tell you right now the publication is Charlton Comics. The title of the comic is, but I haven't picked the story from inside yet, so I've been having some technical difficulties, but we'll get there. All right, so with that, thank you for joining me. I'll catch you on Thursday. Good talk. We had a good talk. Woo! Whoa! The lighting's so soft. Why is the lighting so soft?